is 19 minutes past 7. Now, why are thousands of protesters on the streets right now as I speak in Khabarovsk in Russia's Far East? Steve Rosenberg is our Moscow correspondent, but he has made the long journey east and he is there with them. And we talked about this in the programme yesterday, Steve, but give us a sense first of the context. Why is it that this protest is happening?
Well, people have come onto the streets, and today there are more than 10,000 protesters on the streets of Khabarovsk. They've come to voice their support for their local governor, Sergei Furgal, who was arrested last week and flown to Moscow and accused of being involved in multiple murders dating back 15 years. That really has sparked a lot of anger here in Khabarovsk. A lot of people I've been speaking to the last few days have said, look, we elected this man, our governor, a couple of years ago, and now Moscow has taken him away from us. And so the main demand of the protesters over the last few days has been, send our governor back to Khabarovsk, give him a free and fair trial in our city on home soil. Why do you have to take him and smuggle him away to Moscow? And I think what has happened here has fueled resentment towards Moscow and towards the Kremlin. I noticed actually some of the slogans on the placards today have been anti-Moscow. There was one that said, Moscow is a disgrace. Another one said, Moscow, go away from here. Stop taking our natural resources. So this is feeding into quite deep-seated resentment, I think, with the capital.
A resentment that is dangerous to Vladimir Putin, difficult for him. How does he view what is going on around you, do you think?
Well, it's certainly, at the very least, embarrassing for Vladimir Putin. President Putin likes to project the image of Mr. Stability, the man who is the guarantee of stability in Russia. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, there was a constitutional vote in the country which gives the president the right to stand for office 2 more times. And the Kremlin says, well, that's because the people support Vladimir Putin. But what's happening here undermines that image of Mr. Stability, I think.
And when you talk about the image, to what extent are other Russians in other parts of the country aware of this?
Not very much, because these protests are not being covered on Russian state television, on the main national channels. And that is also stoking anger in Khabarovsk. People realise that, and that makes them even more angry.
Steve Rosenberg in Khabarovsk, thank you very much.
The time now is 22 minutes past 7. The Prime Minister may be hoping for a significant return to normality by Christmas, but in Parliament yesterday, the government's chief medical advisor warned that ministers might have to impose new restrictions to contain the coronavirus during the difficult winter months. Mark Darcy was watching.
Viruses like flu and COVID-19 thrive and spread in the winter months, so tighter restrictions may have to come in to prevent a second spike in the pandemic. The government's chief medical advisor, Professor Chris Whitty, warned that some activities which were possible during the warmer seasons might have to be banned.
I think there are probably, and this is I think is a very common view among doctors and scientists who looked at this, a group of things you could do probably for 3 seasons of the year, but it may be that in winter this is more difficult because winter so benefits respiratory viruses. That's why we get the flus and the colds and coughs in winter. So we do have to accept we may be able to do things for a period, and it's possible that in winter we may have to do some other things. And I think we just have to be honest about that, and the Prime Minister, I think, made that very clear this morning.
Professor Whitty and the Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, were talking to the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee just hours after Boris Johnson had announced cautious plans to lift more restrictions. Sir Patrick said more freedom of movement would mean more infections.
It is inevitable as you get more contact that you will see more cases. I mean, that's what happens, and that's therefore a consequence of anything that's done to release measures.
So he said the important thing was having the ability to contain new outbreaks.
The critical question is measurement and detection as early as possible and understanding how to react to it. And the model that you can see around the world and here is that the most likely thing is that you get an increase in local outbreaks, and those local outbreaks may be very local, which you need to act on quickly and deal with in a way that's proportionate to whatever's happened, so that you don't end up with sort of widespread lockdowns or measures to try and deal with that across the whole of society.
And later in the year, that could mean a wider response was needed.
Come winter, the challenges will be very much greater, and of course there is a risk that this could also need national measures as well.
Professor Whitty said basics like hand washing and social distancing would remain vital. As for face masks, the issue wasn't so much the kind of covering as the way they were used.
The variation in those is much less important than getting people to do the basics. And the basics are, if you're going to wear one in a high-risk area, it must cover your nose and mouth. Wearing a brilliant mask covering half your mouth, only your mouth or only your nose, clearly is only going to have very limited effect.
The peers didn't ask directly about the latest announcements, but Professor Whitty said the scientists were consulted about decisions on the restrictions, but it was the politicians who decided.
Almost invariably, we will be in the room when the big decisions are going to be discussed and can present the data, but then it is ultimately for the senior policymakers to integrate these very difficult, competing, necessary points.
He didn't seem to envy their task.
There is an incredibly difficult balance that the political leaders are having to make, where they're walking a narrow path where on one side we could cause enormous unnecessary economic and social damage, people being isolated, all the unemployment, all the things we read about in the newspapers rightly, and steer too far the other way, and we end up with the epidemic coming back and a second spike. Walking that path is extraordinarily difficult.
And those decisions could involve bringing back, as well as lifting, lockdown restrictions.
Mark Darcy reporting, and you can hear more on events yesterday in Parliament at 9:15 on Radio 4 Longwave and on digital radio. It's 26 minutes past 7, that means it's time for the sport. Gary's here. Not great weather, I think, for the cricket.
You're absolutely spot on. It should be, I would think, a day of dodging raindrops at Old Trafford, where the West Indies are 30